I was sitting in the corner at my daughter's engagement dinner when I heard the words that shattered my world. Her? Living with us? No way! I can barely handle the guilt of keeping that emotional burden at home. Then she looked at me with cold eyes and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "Get out of my life." That night, as tears soaked my pillow, I found a letter hidden for 27 years. A letter from her father revealing a secret that would unravel everything I thought I knew about the daughter I had sacrificed everything for. Behind an old mirror in my bedroom lay evidence of a truth too painful to face. The child I raised might not be mine at all. The next morning, I drove straight to the bank and canceled everything. The wedding venue, the caterer, the flowers, her credit cards. When my phone started ringing nonstop, her desperate voice filling my voicemail, I made a choice that would change both our lives forever. But me? I was too busy to answer. If you want to know what happens next in this emotional story about family secrets, betrayal, and the true meaning of motherhood, make sure to follow the channel, like this video, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. The truth is always more complicated than it seems. I was sitting in the corner of the table, almost hidden behind those extravagant flower arrangements at my daughter's engagement dinner. All I did was smile. I smiled so much my face ached. After all, my only daughter was marrying a doctor, a man from a good family, as she liked to say. I was paying for everything, every fork, every flower, even the dress she didn't yet know I'd had custom made for her. That's when I heard it. It wasn't a shout, but it wounded me like one. She said to her future mother-in-law, right there across the table, "Huh? Living with us? No way! I can barely handle the guilt of keeping that emotional burden at home." The laugh that followed was what truly tore me apart inside. I stood up slowly, clutching my napkin, already damp with tears I'd been fighting to swallow. But before I could leave, she looked at me with contempt and said, loud enough to silence the clinking of silverware, "Get out of my life." I remember the restaurant went quiet. You know that stillness that falls when everyone pretends they didn't hear something terrible? That heavy silence where people suddenly find their plates fascinating? That's what happened. The Bellini's waitstaff froze mid-step, pretending to be invisible. I could feel 20 pairs of eyes avoiding mine. My daughter, my Rebecca, didn't even flinch after saying those words. She just turned back to her future mother-in-law, this perfectly coiffed woman with diamond earrings worth more than my house, and continued talking about wedding venues as if I'd already disappeared. I didn't make a scene. That's not who I am. I've spent 67 years being the woman who holds it together. When my husband left, when money ran out, when the electric company threatened to cut power during Rebecca's finals week, I never crumbled. I just found a way. As I gathered my purse, the same worn leather one I've carried for 12 years, Rebecca's fiancé, Dr. Matthew Crawford, caught my eye across the table. For just a second, I thought I saw something there. Pity? Embarrassment? Whatever it was, it vanished when Rebecca squeezed his hand. Outside, the September air felt like a slap. Boston was already getting that autumn chill, the kind that gets into your bones when you're my age. I fumbled for my car keys, vision blurred, and that's when I saw it. The receipt from earlier that day. $14,500 for the wedding venue deposit. Money from my retirement savings. Money I'd set aside for the medications my insurance wouldn't cover. That night I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the water stain on my ceiling, replaying every sacrifice. The second job I took when Rebecca needed braces. The nursing shifts I traded to attend her college graduation. The prescriptions I'd rationed to afford her law school applications. And that moment, 15 years ago, when I sold my mother's jewelry to put a down payment on Rebecca's first apartment. I got up around 3 a.m., bones creaking, to search for tissues in the back of my dresser drawer. That's when I found it. The letter from her father, dated 1997. I'd never opened it. He'd left when Rebecca was just 3, disappeared to start a new family in Colorado, with a dental hygienist half his age. I'd received the letter a few years later, but couldn't bear to read his excuses. But that night was different. With my daughter's words still echoing in my ears, I carefully broke the seal. The handwriting was shaky, masculine, familiar. The paper smelled faintly of the cologne he used to wear. As I began to read, my hands trembled worse than they do with my arthritis. "Margaret," it began. No dear, no my love, just my name. Cold, clinical. The words blurred as tears finally came. But one sentence stood out with terrible clarity. "There are things about Rebecca you don't know. Things I discovered before I left." I dropped the letter as if it had burned me. Outside my window, a car alarm went off, its wailing matching the panic rising in my chest. What could he possibly mean? What secrets could exist about the child I'd raised alone for 20 years? I picked up the letter again, forcing myself to continue. Each word felt like another brick on my chest, making it harder to breathe. "When you're ready to know the truth," the letter concluded, "look behind the mirror on your dresser. I left something there the day I walked out. Maybe someday you'll understand why I had to go." I turned toward my dresser, the same one we'd bought as newlyweds at a garage sale in 1979. The mirror was tarnished now, spotted with age like my hands. My reflection looked ghostly in the dim light. A woman I barely recognized staring back at me. With shaking fingers, I reached for the mirror, wondering what terrible secret had been hiding in my bedroom for more than 2 decades. The next morning, as the first light of dawn crept through my windows, I made a decision. I dressed carefully in my best blouse, the blue one Rebecca had given me 3 Christmases ago, still with the tags attached because I'd been saving it for a special occasion. I applied lipstick, something I rarely bothered with anymore. Then I drove to the bank. I was waiting when they opened at 9 a.m. sharp. The young man at the desk, couldn't have been older than 25, looked surprised when I told him what I wanted to do. He asked me 3 times if I was certain. Each time, I just nodded. As I signed the final form, canceling every payment for Rebecca's wedding, my phone began to ring. Her picture flashed on the screen, a beautiful girl in graduation cap and gown, smiling with the future bright before her, a future I'd sacrificed everything to give her. But me? I was too busy to answer. The handwriting was shaky, masculine, familiar. When I began reading, I recognized the scent of the past. The man who abandoned me when our daughter was only 3 years old, whom I cursed at every birthday, was now asking for forgiveness and saying he left not out of cowardice, but out of fear. My fingers traced each word as if they might reveal something deeper than what was written. Richard's handwriting had changed. It was less confident than I remembered, with letters that tilted awkwardly to the right, like they were falling. The paper itself was expensive, thick cream stationery that felt out of place in my modest bedroom with its faded wallpaper and second-hand furniture. "Margaret," the letter began, "I've written this letter 100 times in my head. Now I'm finally putting it on paper, though I don't know if you'll ever read it. There's something you need to know, something I discovered shortly before I left." My heart hammered against my ribs as I continued reading. The digital clock on my nightstand flashed 3:47 a.m., its red glow the only light besides the dim lamp at my bedside. Outside, the occasional car passed by, headlights briefly illuminating my ceiling before disappearing again, like memories too painful to hold on to. "I found something that made me question everything," Richard wrote. "Not my love for you, that was real, but about Rebecca." My throat tightened. What could he possibly know about our daughter that I didn't? "There was a doctor at the hospital where you worked. His name was Hank Stevenson, a resident in obstetrics. I found receipts from meetings at the Greenwood Cafe, always during your lunch breaks. Then there were the phone calls that would end abruptly when I entered the room. I nearly tore the letter in half right then. How dare he? I'd never been unfaithful, not once in our marriage. The Greenwood Cafe was where all the hospital staff ate lunch. And those phone calls? They were from bill collectors I didn't want Richard to know about, because he always panicked about money. But something kept me reading, a sick feeling spreading through my stomach like ice water. I wouldn't have cared if it was just an affair, Margaret. We could have worked through that. But then I saw the blood type on Rebecca's medical chart during her appendix surgery. AB negative. Neither of us has that blood type. It's impossible for her to be mine. My hands trembled so violently that the paper rattled. This was absurd. A mistake. There had never been any Hank, any affair. The worst part is, Richard continued, I couldn't stop loving her. Every time she called me Daddy, every time she fell asleep on my chest, I loved her like my own. But I couldn't live with the lie. It was eating me alive, wondering if you were still seeing him, wondering if you were laughing at me behind my back. Tears splashed onto the paper, blurring the ink. After all these years, this is what he believed, this fiction he'd created in his mind. I know what you're thinking, the letter went on, as if he could see me sitting there 25 years later reading his words. You're thinking I'm crazy or making excuses, but blood doesn't lie, Margaret. I had the tests run twice to be sure. I shook my head in disbelief. Rebecca had my eyes, Richard's smile. She had his tendency to tap her fingers when nervous, my inability to carry a tune. How could he think? I would have loved her anyway, but I couldn't lie to myself anymore. The doubt consumed me until I couldn't look at either of you without wondering. The final paragraph made my blood run cold. If someday she turns on you, if someday she shows you the same coldness I've seen glimpses of even when she was small, look behind the mirror on your dresser. I left something there that might help you understand everything, and maybe then you'll forgive me for not being strong enough to stay. I lowered the letter to my lap, staring at the dresser mirror across the room. It had hung there since we first bought this house in 1979, an antique even then, with a wooden frame now worn at the edges. What secret could possibly be hidden there for all these years? For several minutes I couldn't move. The weight of Richard's accusations, the memories of raising Rebecca alone, the cold words she'd flung at me earlier that evening, it all pressed down on me like a physical force. Finally I stood, my knees protesting with a familiar ache. 3 steps to the dresser felt like 30. I stared at my reflection, a tired woman with silver hair and lines etched deeply around her eyes and mouth, eyes that looked so much like Rebecca's. I hesitated, then reached behind the mirror. My fingers brushed against something taped to the back, something that had been waiting there silently while I'd spent decades in this house, unaware. An envelope, yellowed with age, secured with clear tape now brittle and brown. I carefully pulled it free, the adhesive giving way with a soft tearing sound that seemed too loud in the quiet room. The envelope was sealed, but the glue had long since dried out. Inside were 2 photographs and what looked like a lab report. I slid them out with trembling hands but couldn't bring myself to look yet. Instead, I sat back on the edge of my bed, the envelope clutched to my chest. What have you done, Richard? I whispered to the empty room. Outside my window, the first birds began to sing, announcing the arrival of morning. A new day was coming, one that might change everything I thought I knew about my life, my daughter, and the sacrifices I'd made. I took a deep breath and looked down at what Richard had left me, the supposed proof that would explain why he abandoned his family all those years ago. Whatever it contained, I knew one thing for certain. Tomorrow, I would do exactly what my daughter had asked of me. I would step out of her life, but first, I had a wedding to cancel. I approached the mirror with trembling hands. It was old with a chipped frame, the only object remaining from our marital bedroom. My reflection stared back at me, a woman I barely recognized. Hollowed cheeks, dark circles under my eyes, silver hair that had once been auburn. The same mirror that had witnessed me getting ready for my wedding day, now witnessing another kind of unraveling. The bedroom was eerily quiet at that hour, just before dawn. The only sounds were my shallow breathing and the occasional car passing on the street outside. The pale blue walls that I'd never gotten around to repainting seemed to close in around me as I carefully lifted the mirror from its hook. It was heavier than I remembered, and my arthritic hands protested as I set it down on the bed. There it was, an aged envelope, yellowed and curled at the edges, secured with old masking tape that had long since lost most of its adhesive. With fingers that wouldn't stop shaking, I carefully peeled it away. The tape crumbled between my fingers, leaving behind a sticky residue, a ghost of something meant to stay hidden forever. Inside the envelope were 2 photographs and a wrinkled laboratory report, the paper thin and delicate from age. I took a deep breath before looking at them, steeling myself for whatever truths they might reveal. The first photo showed Rebecca as a baby, those same bright eyes I'd gazed into countless times, the wispy blonde hair that had darkened as she grew older. But she wasn't in my arms. She was being held by a young woman I recognized immediately, Sandra Peterson, the receptionist from the maternity ward where I'd given birth. My blood ran cold as memories flooded back. Sandra had been pregnant at the same time as me. We'd often chat in the hospital cafeteria during my prenatal checkups, comparing due dates and symptoms. She was expecting a girl too. We'd even joked about our daughters becoming friends someday. But then I heard that Sandra's baby had died during delivery, a tragedy that the hospital staff spoke of in hushed tones. I remembered how she'd come to visit me the day after Rebecca was born. Her eyes red-rimmed from crying, her arms empty when they should have been cradling her own infant. She'd held Rebecca briefly, tears streaming down her face. I thought it was grief for her lost child. Now looking at this photograph, I wasn't so sure. With hands that felt disconnected from my body, I turned to the second photo. It showed Sandra again, this time with a man I didn't recognize. Tall, with dark hair and a serious expression. They were standing outside the hospital and Sandra was wearing scrubs. The man had his arm around her protectively. Written on the back in Richard's handwriting, Sandra and Dr. Hank Stevenson, Boston Memorial, 1979. Hank Stevenson, the name from Richard's letter. Finally, I forced myself to look at the laboratory report. It was a DNA paternity test, dated October 1994, just months before Richard left us. The results showed 3 names: Richard Wilson, my ex-husband, Margaret Wilson, me, and a third name that had been smudged with what looked like water or tears, making it illegible. The conclusion was clearly visible though. Probability of paternity, 0%. My knees gave way. I sank to the floor, clutching these fragments of a past I didn't recognize. The room spun around me as impossible questions flooded my mind. Was Rebecca not my daughter? Had there been a mix-up at the hospital? Or worse, had something more deliberate happened? I remembered the day she was born so vividly. The 26 hours of labor, the emergency C-section when her heart rate dropped, the drugs that kept me unconscious longer than expected. When I finally held her, they told me she'd been in the nursery for nearly 12 hours while I recovered. I'd been too exhausted, too overwhelmed with love for this tiny creature to question anything. Through the haze of shock, memories resurfaced, tiny details I'd dismissed over the years. How Richard had seemed oddly distant those first few weeks after her birth. How he'd sometimes stare at Rebecca with a strange expression when he thought I wasn't looking. The whispered phone calls that ended abruptly when I entered the room, but more painful were the memories of Rebecca herself. The thousands of nights I'd rocked her to sleep, the first steps I'd cheered for, the fevers I'd nursed her through, the college tuition I'd worked 3 jobs to pay. If she wasn't biologically mine, did that erase those 27 years of motherhood? No, I whispered fiercely to the empty room. No. I pushed myself up from the floor, my joints protesting. The sky outside my window was beginning to lighten, the first streaks of dawn painting the horizon. In a few hours, the world would be awake, and I would have to decide what to do with this revelation. But even in this moment of earth-shattering doubt, one certainty remained. I had loved Rebecca as only a mother could. Whether we shared blood or not, I had given her everything I had, every sacrifice, every sleepless night, every dollar saved. They were all real. And her words at the engagement dinner, "Get out of my life," those were real too. I carefully gathered the photos and the lab report, sliding them back into the envelope. Then I did something I never thought I'd do. I went to my closet and pulled out my old suitcase, the one I'd used on our honeymoon to Cape Cod nearly 30 years ago. The zipper stuck from disuse, but it finally gave way. Right there, in the pale light of early morning, I decided that I would do exactly as my daughter wished. I would remove myself from her life, completely. But not before I finished what I'd started at the bank. If she truly wasn't mine, if I'd spent my life raising another woman's child while believing she was my own, then she would learn what it meant to stand on her own. without my credit cards, without my savings, without the wedding I'd been planning to give her. As I placed the envelope in my purse and headed for the door, I felt strangely calm. There was a clarity that came with this kind of pain, a sharpening of purpose. If Rebecca wanted me gone, she would get her wish. But first, I had one more stop to make. I walked into First National Bank at exactly 8:57 a.m., 3 minutes before they officially opened. The security guard, Ronald, who'd known me for 15 years, nodded and let me in anyway. The marble floor gleamed under the fluorescent lights, making everything look colder, more clinical, like a hospital. The thought made my stomach clench as I remembered the photos I'd found behind the mirror. "Morning, Mrs. Wilson," Ronald said, his voice echoing in the empty lobby. "You're bright and early today." I managed a tight smile. "Important business, Ronald." He couldn't have known that my purse contained not just my checkbook and ID, but also the remnants of my life's biggest lie, photographs of a baby who might not be mine, held by a woman who wasn't me. I sat on one of the leather chairs in the waiting area, my back straight despite the ache that had settled between my shoulder blades. My mother had always said that good posture was armor. When your heart's breaking, she'd told me, sit up straight, don't let them see you crumble. So I sat there, spine rigid, as if I could hold together the pieces of my shattering world through sheer will. At precisely 9 a.m., a young man approached, the bank manager's new assistant. His navy suit looked too big for his slender frame, like he was playing dress-up in his father's clothes. "Mrs. Wilson, I'm Tyler. Mr. Grayson asked me to help you today. He's at a meeting across town." Tyler couldn't have been older than 25, about the same age I'd been when I first held Rebecca in my arms. He had kind eyes, the sort that hadn't yet learned to mask pity. "I need to make some changes to my accounts," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. Immediately, he led me to a small office with glass walls. I could see the whole bank from there. The tellers preparing for the day, a maintenance man buffing the floor, the first customers trickling in. Life continuing as if mine hadn't just been upended. "What can I help you with today, Mrs. Wilson?" Tyler asked, his fingers poised over his keyboard. I placed my purse on the desk, unzipping it slowly. From it, I withdrew a folder containing all the wedding expenses, color-coded and organized by date. $27,000 already spent. Another $48,000 pending in the coming weeks. The caterer, the venue, the flowers, the photographer. The dress I'd secretly paid extra to have rush altered to fit Rebecca perfectly. "I need to cancel every pending transaction related to these accounts," I said, sliding the folder across to him. "And I need to freeze all my credit cards, the ones with authorized users." Tyler's eyes widened slightly as he flipped through the documents. "That's quite substantial, Mrs. Wilson. May I ask if there's a problem with the vendors?" "The problem isn't with the vendors." My voice sounded distant to my own ears. "The wedding is canceled." "I see." He didn't see. How could he? "And the 3 credit cards that have Rebecca Wilson as an authorized user, you want those frozen as well?" "Yes." The word felt like a stone in my mouth. Effective immediately. Tyler looked at me with that same kindness that now felt like sandpaper against my raw emotions. "Mrs. Wilson, sometimes families have disagreements. Are you sure?" "My daughter told me to get out of her life," I interrupted, the words spilling out before I could stop them. "Last night, at her engagement dinner, the one I paid for." His fingers stilled over the keyboard. "I'm so sorry." "Don't be. Just cancel everything." As Tyler worked, making calls and typing commands into his computer, I stared out the glass walls of the office. The bank was filling up now. A young mother struggled through the door with a stroller. An elderly couple waited patiently at the counter. A businessman checked his watch impatiently. Normal people with normal problems. "This will take some time to process completely," Tyler said after about 40 minutes. "But I've initiated all the cancellations and freezes. The credit cards are already suspended. The pending transfers to vendors will be halted by end of business today." "And Rebecca won't be able to use the cards anymore? Starting now?" "That's correct. They're already frozen." I nodded, gathering my purse. As I stood to leave, Tyler cleared his throat. Mrs. Wilson? I don't mean to overstep, but are you all right? Is there someone I can call for you? The question caught me off guard. Was I all right? I had just discovered that my only child might not be mine biologically. The daughter I had sacrificed everything for had publicly humiliated me and told me to get out of her life. And in response, I was systematically dismantling the wedding I'd spent months planning and years saving for. I'm fine, I lied, the words hollow even to my own ears. Outside the bank, the September sun was bright but offered no warmth. I checked my phone out of habit. 17 missed calls, 12 text messages, all from Rebecca. Mom, where are you? The caterer says there's a problem with the payment. Mom, pick up. This is important. The venue just called. What's going on with the deposit? Answer your phone. Mom, please. Matthew is freaking out. His mother is asking questions. Whatever I said last night, I'm sorry. Just call me back. I turned off my phone completely. The silence that followed felt like the first moment of peace I'd had in years. In my car, I sat for several minutes without starting the engine. The envelope from behind the mirror seemed to burn in my purse. I should go to the hospital, I thought. Find records, ask questions, track down this Sandra Peterson or Hank Stevenson, get answers. But something stopped me. A bone-deep weariness that made even the thought of investigation feel impossible. What would it change? 27 years of memories, of love, of sacrifice. Did a DNA test make those any less real? As I finally started the car, I realized I had nowhere particular to go. For nearly 3 decades, my life had revolved around Rebecca, her needs, her wants, her future. Now, with her words still ringing in my ears and the evidence of a possible deception heavy in my purse, I was adrift. I drove home slowly, barely noticing the familiar streets and houses. When I pulled into my driveway, I wasn't surprised to see Rebecca's red BMW parked at the curb. Of course, she would come here once the money stopped flowing. Of course. As I sat in my car, watching her pace on my front porch, her phone pressed to her ear, I made a decision. I wouldn't confront her with what I'd found. Not yet. First, I needed to understand what it meant to me. Because while Rebecca had thrown away our relationship like it meant nothing, I wasn't ready to do the same. But I also wasn't ready to answer her calls, or her questions, or her door. For once in my life, I was going to put myself first. And right now, that meant driving away before she saw me. As I backed out of the driveway, Rebecca looked up, our eyes meeting through the windshield. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion to desperation in the span of seconds. She ran toward the car, waving frantically. But me? I was too busy to answer. At night, a knock on the door. When I opened it, I froze. It was him, her father, the man I had loved and hated for decades, with snow-white hair, a wooden cane, and wet eyes. He knew I had read the letter. Richard looked nothing like the man who had walked out of our lives 24 years ago. His once broad shoulders now stooped forward, as if carrying an invisible weight. The confident jawline I had once traced with my fingertips had softened, hidden beneath a neatly trimmed white beard. Only his eyes remained the same, that particular shade of blue that used to remind me of summer skies, now clouded with age and regret. "Margaret," he said, his voice raspier than I remembered. "May I come in?" I stood in the doorway, one hand gripping the frame so tightly my knuckles turned white. Behind him, raindrops glistened on the driveway under the porch light. When had it started raining? I hadn't even noticed. "Why are you here?" I asked, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. He shifted his weight, leaning more heavily on his cane. "I think you know why." We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Two people who had once shared everything, now strangers connected only by painful memories, and a daughter who might not even be ours. Finally, I stepped aside. My living room looked smaller with him in it. Richard moved carefully, his cane making a soft thud against the hardwood floor with each step. He paused at the mantel, studying the photographs displayed there. Rebecca's high school graduation, her law school commencement, her at the beach last summer. Conspicuously absent were any photos of him. You've done a wonderful job with her, he said softly, not turning around. Why are you here, Richard? I repeated, remaining standing while he lowered himself into what used to be his favorite armchair. The irony wasn't lost on me. He placed both hands on top of his cane, his wedding ring conspicuously absent. I'd kept mine for years after he left, only removing it when Rebecca started asking questions. I knew you'd find it eventually, he said. The envelope. I've been waiting for your call for 24 years. You could have told me to my face, I said, the anger I'd suppressed for decades finally seeping into my voice. Instead of sneaking away like a thief in the night, instead of hiding evidence behind a mirror like some spy novel plot device. Richard's eyes dropped to his hands. I couldn't face you, Margaret. I couldn't bear to see your expression when you realized what I'd discovered. And what exactly did you discover? That our daughter, the child we planned, the baby I carried for 9 months, the girl I raised, might not be biologically related to you? Was that reason enough to abandon us? His head snapped up. That's not what the test showed. The room suddenly felt airless. What do you mean? Margaret, the DNA test. It showed that Rebecca wasn't related to either of us. The words hit me like a physical blow. I sank onto the sofa, my legs no longer able to support me. That's impossible. I wish it were. His voice cracked. I ran the test twice. Different labs. Same result. My mind raced through the possibilities. A lab error. A mix-up with the samples. Or something far worse. Something I'd suspected since finding the photographs behind the mirror. Sandra Peterson, I whispered. Richard nodded slowly. The receptionist at the maternity ward. Her baby girl died during delivery the same day you gave birth to Rebecca. So you think she, what? Switched the babies? Took our healthy daughter and gave us her dead one? That's insane, Richard. Someone would have noticed. Not if she had help. He hesitated. Hank Stevenson was the attending physician for both deliveries. My hands trembled as I remembered the photograph of Sandra and Hank standing together outside the hospital. You thought I was having an affair with him. That's what your letter implied. Richard's expression softened. At first, yes. I found records of calls between your hospital extension and his, lunch meetings, but then I realized it wasn't an affair. It was something worse. You think they conspired to switch babies? And you never told me. You just left. He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. I couldn't prove it, Margaret. I hired a private investigator, but Sandra had moved away. Hank was practicing in Seattle by then. All I had was a DNA test showing that the child we were raising wasn't ours biologically. How could I tell you that? How could I rip away the foundation of your life? So instead, you ripped away my husband. The bitterness in my voice surprised even me. I was a coward, he admitted. I told myself I was protecting you both, that you'd be better off without me questioning everything, looking at Rebecca, and wondering about her real parents. But the truth is, I couldn't bear it. Every time she called me Daddy, every time she looked at me with those eyes that weren't mine, I was dying inside. We sat in heavy silence, two broken people confronting a past neither of us had truly understood. Did you ever look for her? I finally asked. Our biological daughter? Pain flashed across his face. Yes. The investigator found records of an infant girl, delivered to Sandra and her husband 3 months after they left Boston. They moved to Arizona. Named her Emma. Is she... I couldn't finish the question. She's alive, healthy. Graduated from UCLA 5 years ago. Works as a graphic designer in San Diego. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew a folded photograph, holding it out to me with a trembling hand. I took it, afraid of what I might see. The photo showed a young woman with auburn hair, my color before it turned gray, smiling on a beach at sunset. She had Richard's nose, my mother's chin, a stranger who looked more familiar than she should have. You've been watching her, I said, not a question, from a distance. I never approached her, never interfered. Her parents, the Petersons, they don't know I know. I handed the photograph back, unable to look at it any longer. And Rebecca, have you been watching her too? He nodded, a sad smile crossing his face. Every year on her birthday, from across the street at her graduation ceremonies. Once, I sat 3 rows behind you at her piano recital when she was 12. The thought of him lurking in the shadows of our lives made me shiver. "Why are you here now, Richard? After all this time?" He looked older suddenly, the weight of decades pressing down on him. "I'm dying, Margaret. Pancreatic cancer. Stage 4. He said it simply, without self-pity. "The doctors give me a month, maybe 2. I should have felt something. Grief, perhaps, or satisfaction that karma had finally caught up with him. Instead, I felt oddly hollow. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Before I go, I wanted to give you this." He reached into his pocket again and pulled out an envelope. "A letter I wrote for Rebecca, explaining everything. I've never had the courage to give it to her. I thought, perhaps you might—" "Why would I do that? Why would I destroy her world the way you destroyed mine?" His blue eyes locked with mine. "Because yesterday she told you to get out of her life, and I know you're wondering if any of it was real. All those years of loving a child who might not be yours by blood. I thought you deserved to know that I've asked myself the same question every day for 24 years. I took the envelope, feeling its weight in my hands. Not the physical weight, but the burden of truth it contained. A truth that could shatter Rebecca's identity as completely as it had shattered our family. "I should go," Richard said, struggling to his feet. I didn't offer to help him. At the door, he paused, looking back at me with those familiar blue eyes. "For what it's worth, Margaret, I never stopped loving you, or her." After he left, I sat alone in the darkening room, the rain pattering against the windows, 2 envelopes in my lap, one containing a truth that had destroyed my past, the other a truth that could destroy Rebecca's future. Outside, lightning flashed, briefly illuminating the empty driveway where Richard's car had been. Thunder followed seconds later, the sound like distant drums announcing a coming storm. On the morning of the wedding, the church was dark. No flowers, no music. Confused guests milled about outside. My daughter wept by the entrance, fully dressed, makeup done, begging for help from passers-by. The groom never showed up. St. Andrew's Episcopal Church stood like a stone sentinel against the pale blue September sky. Its Gothic spire reached heavenward, innocent of the human drama unfolding at its feet. I parked my car across the street, hidden behind a delivery van, and watched. The wedding had been scheduled for 11 a.m. It was now 10:47, and already I could see the confusion spreading through the small crowd gathered on the church steps. Women in pastel dresses and men in dark suits checked their phones, glancing repeatedly at the church's heavy wooden doors, which remained firmly closed. No ushers greeted them. No programs were distributed. The string quartet that should have been playing Pachelbel's canon was conspicuously absent. And there, pacing frantically at the bottom of the steps, was Rebecca. Even from a distance, she looked beautiful. The dress I'd secretly paid to have altered fit her perfectly. Ivory lace over champagne silk, with a cathedral train that now dragged across the concrete. Her dark hair was pinned up with pearl clips that had belonged to my mother. She wore the diamond earrings I'd given her for her 21st birthday. She looked exactly as I'd imagined she would on her wedding day, except for the panic etched across her face. I watched as she tried the church doors again, pulling frantically at the handles. Locked. Of course they were locked. The final payment for the church rental had been among those I'd canceled at the bank. A sleek black car pulled up, and Rebecca's future mother-in-law emerged, dressed impeccably in powder blue. Even from my hiding place, I could see the tight set of her mouth, the rigid posture that spoke of barely contained fury. She marched up to Rebecca, gesturing sharply. Though I couldn't hear their words, their body language told the story. Accusation, denial, escalating anger. More guests arrived, their expressions shifting from anticipation to confusion. A woman I recognized as Rebecca's maid of honor, her college roommate, Jen, hurried up the steps, phone pressed to her ear. She spoke to Rebecca, who shook her head violently, mascara now streaming down her cheeks. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. Part of me wanted to go to her, to fix everything as I always had. But another part, the part that still heard her say, "Get out of my life," in that cold, dismissive tone, kept me rooted in my seat. At 11:15, something shifted in the crowd. A murmur spread, heads turning toward another black car that had just arrived. Rebecca spun to face it, her expression hopeful. But when the door opened, it wasn't Matthew who stepped out. It was his father, Dr. Crawford Sr., his face a mask of cold fury. He spoke briefly to his wife, then turned to address the gathered guests. Though I couldn't hear him, I knew what he was saying. The wedding was canceled. Please return home. We apologize for the inconvenience. People began to leave, casting backward glances at Rebecca, who stood frozen on the steps. Her future mother-in-law placed a hand on her arm, then recoiled as if burned when Rebecca jerked away. Words were exchanged, harsh ones, judging by how Rebecca's hands clenched into fists at her sides. Then she was alone, standing in her wedding dress on the steps of a locked church, abandoned by her groom, her guests, her future in-laws. I should have felt vindicated. After all, wasn't this exactly what I'd wanted when I canceled those payments? For her to understand, finally, what it meant to be abandoned by someone you trusted. Instead, I felt hollow. Because even now, seeing her broken and alone, I loved her. Whether she was my biological daughter or not, she was the child I had raised, the baby I had rocked to sleep, the little girl whose skinned knees I had bandaged, the teenager whose heart I had mended after her first breakup. I was about to start the car, to drive away before she could see me, when my phone rang. The screen displayed a number I didn't recognize. I almost didn't answer, but something, intuition perhaps, made me press the green button. Mrs. Wilson? A man's voice, vaguely familiar. This is Dr. Matthew Crawford. My breath caught. Rebecca's fiancé, the man who should have been at the altar right now. I think you should know why I didn't show up today, he continued, his voice tight. Last night my father received a call from our accountant. Apparently Rebecca has been using my credit cards to pay off debts I knew nothing about. Student loans, shopping expenses, even payments to someone named Carlos that she claimed was a personal trainer, but... He paused. Well, the text messages my father's investigator found suggest otherwise. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. What are you saying? I'm saying she's been lying to me, to all of us, about everything. The trust fund she claimed to have doesn't exist. The job offer in New York, fabricated. She even told me you were paying for only half the wedding, when it turns out you were covering everything. His voice cracked slightly. When the venue called yesterday to say the final payment had been canceled, it all started to unravel. I closed my eyes, memories flooding back. Rebecca's unexplained shopping bags, the calls she'd taken another room, the way she'd changed the subject whenever money came up. Had I been blind to this too? I'm sorry, I said, though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. Don't be. You did me a favor, Mrs. Wilson. You saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life. After we hung up, I sat in silence for several minutes, watching as Rebecca finally walked away from the church, her wedding dress gathered in her arms, her head bowed. She climbed into her red BMW, the one I'd helped her buy, with the understanding she'd make the payments I now suspected I'd been making all along. I started my car and followed her at a distance. She drove erratically, too fast at times, then slowing suddenly, nearly missing turns. I knew where she was headed before she even turned onto my street. By the time I pulled into my driveway, she was already on my porch, still in her wedding dress, makeup streaked across her face. When she saw me, she froze, then rushed toward my car. Mom, she sobbed as I stepped out. Everything's ruined. Matthew didn't show up. The church was locked. Nobody would help me. I looked at her, this beautiful, broken young woman who might not be my daughter by blood, but who had been my entire world for 27 years. In that moment, I made a decision. I reached into my purse and pulled out Richard's letter, the one he'd written to Rebecca explaining everything. We need to talk, I said quietly. There's something you need to know. She asked me, her voice trembling. Am I really your daughter? I could have lied, said yes, or I could have told everything. I took a deep breath and I told her about the letter, about the mirror, about the DNA, about the receptionist at the maternity ward. We sat at my kitchen table. the same oak table where I'd helped Rebecca with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays, where I'd sat alone countless nights after she'd left for college, the wedding dress pooled around her like spilled cream, the delicate beading catching the afternoon light that filtered through the window blinds. Outside, the neighborhood went about its business, children riding bikes, someone mowing a lawn, the mail carrier making his rounds, oblivious to the earthquake happening within these walls. Rebecca's hands shook as she held Richard's letter, unopened. Her mascara had left dark trails down her cheeks, her carefully styled hair now falling in loose strands around her face. In that moment she looked young again, vulnerable, like the little girl who'd crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. "Before you read that," I said gently, "there's something I need to tell you, something I just learned myself." Her red-rimmed eyes met mine, wary and wounded. "What is it?" I reached for my purse, pulling out the yellowed envelope from behind the mirror. My fingers trembled as I laid it on the table between us. "Your father, Richard, left this for me to find. I only discovered it 2 days ago." "What is it?" she repeated, not touching the envelope. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, if there even were right words for something like this. "Rebecca, there's a possibility, a strong possibility based on what's in here, that you might not be my biological daughter." The words hung in the air between us, impossible to take back. Rebecca stared at me, motionless, as if she hadn't quite processed what I'd said. "What are you talking about?" Her voice was barely a whisper. Slowly I explained everything. The letter from Richard, the DNA test results, the photographs of Sandra Peterson and Dr. Hank Stevenson, the theory that babies might have been switched at the hospital. With each word, I watched her face transform, from confusion to disbelief to horror. "That's impossible," she finally said, her voice flat. "You're making this up to punish me for what I said at the engagement dinner, for the wedding being cancelled." "I wish I were," I said softly. "Look." I slid the photographs across the table. Rebecca picked them up with shaking hands, staring at the image of herself as a newborn in Sandra's arms. "This doesn't prove anything," she said, but doubt had crept into her voice. "This could be anyone, any baby." "There's also this." I hesitated before showing her the DNA test results. "Your father had this done shortly before he left us." She took the paper, her eyes scanning the clinical language, the conclusive statement at the bottom. Probability of paternity, 0%. Then beneath it, another line. Probability of maternity, 0%. Rebecca's face drained of all color. The paper slipped from her fingers, floating to the table like a dead leaf. "If this is true," she whispered, "then who am I?" The question cut through me like a knife. Who was she? The baby I'd carried for 9 months? The child I'd raised for 27 years? Or someone else's daughter, given to me through some terrible mistake? Or worse, deliberate deception? "You're Rebecca Wilson," I said firmly. "You're the little girl who named all her stuffed animals after characters from Little Women. You're the teenager who spent 3 weeks' allowance on a rescue puppy, then convinced me to let you keep it. You're the young woman who graduated magna cum laude from Boston University." I reached across the table to take her hand. "You're my daughter." "But I'm not, am I?" Tears welled in her eyes again. "Not really, not by blood. Blood isn't the only thing that makes a family, Rebecca." She pulled her hand away, standing so abruptly that her chair tipped over, clattering against the linoleum floor. Don't try to make this okay. Nothing about this is okay." Her voice rose, cracking with emotion. "My entire life is a lie. I'm a lie." "That's not true, isn't it?" She paced the small kitchen, her wedding dress dragging behind her. "If I'm not your daughter, then whose daughter am I? If my name isn't Rebecca Wilson, then what is it? If my birthday isn't April 12th, then when was I actually born?" She stopped suddenly, turning to face me with dawning horror. "Oh God, my medical history, my allergies, my risk factors. None of that information is accurate, is it? I hadn't even thought of that." "I don't know." "You don't know." She laughed, a hollow sound without humor. "Of course you don't know, because you didn't know I wasn't your daughter for 27 years. "Rebecca, don't call me that," she shouted, That's not my name. That's the name you gave to your daughter. Your real daughter who died." The words hung in the air like shattered glass. I felt each one cutting into me. "We don't know that," I said quietly. "We don't know what happened to my biological child." Rebecca froze. "What do you mean?" I hesitated, then decided she deserved the whole truth. "Your father, Richard, told me last night that he hired a private investigator years ago. He believes our biological daughter is alive, that she was raised by Sandra Peterson and her husband in Arizona, that her name is Emma." Rebecca sank slowly back into her chair, her expression unreadable. "Emma," she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. "Emma Peterson. We don't know for certain. Stop saying that." She slammed her palm against the table. "Stop pretending this is all some vague possibility. You've shown me the evidence. You've told me what he found. It's real. It's happening." Her voice broke. "I'm not who I thought I was." We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. Outside, the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. I thought about all the moments we'd shared in this house, the birthdays, the holidays, the ordinary Tuesdays that had seemed so mundane at the time, but now felt precious beyond measure. "If you kept this hidden for so long," Rebecca finally said, her voice thick with emotion, "what else haven't you told me? What other secrets are buried in this house?" I met her gaze steadily. If I hid it, it was out of love. Something in her expression softened then, just slightly, but enough for me to see a glimmer of the daughter I knew. "If that's true," she whispered, "then I forgive you." She reached for Richard's letter, still unopened on the table between us. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. As she read, I watched the last pieces of her old life crumble away and wondered what would be built from the ruins. Her father died 2 weeks later. He left just one request, that she attend his funeral. She went, with the flowers that remained from the wedding that never happened. She cried over the coffin of a man she barely knew, but who had loved her in the only way he could. The funeral home sat on a quiet street lined with maple trees, just beginning to turn golden in the early October air. Gray stone exterior, pristine white columns, and stained glass windows that cast kaleidoscope patterns across the mourners gathered inside. There weren't many, perhaps 20 people in total, scattered across pews meant for hundreds. Richard had lived his final years in a small apartment in Belmont, just 30 minutes from our house. All those years he'd been so close, watching from the shadows, loving from a distance. The thought still made my chest ache with a complex emotion I couldn't name. Not quite anger, not quite sorrow, but some painful blend of both. I sat in the back row, dressed in a simple black dress I'd worn to too many funerals over the years. Rebecca sat 3 rows ahead, straight-backed and still. She wore black too, but in her hands was something unexpected. A small bouquet of ivory roses and baby's breath, salvaged from what would have been her bridal bouquet. When the minister invited loved ones to speak, no one moved at first. Richard had lived a solitary life after leaving us, it seemed. Finally, an elderly man, his college roommate, I later learned, shared a few anecdotes from their youth. Then a nurse from the hospice spoke briefly about Richard's dignity in his final days. The silence that followed was heavy, expectant. I saw Rebecca's shoulders tense, her head bowing slightly. Then, as if gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, she stood and walked to the podium. She looked different than she had just 2 weeks earlier. Thinner, perhaps. Older, certainly. The bright, entitled young woman who had told me to get out of her life seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone more subdued, more thoughtful. She placed the small bouquet on the podium and adjusted the microphone. "My name is Rebecca Wilson," she began, her voice soft but clear. "And the man we're honoring today was my father. Though, as I've recently learned, not by blood." A murmur rippled through the small gathering. Rebecca waited for it to subside before continuing. 2 weeks ago, I discovered that I am not who I thought I was. That the woman who raised me, her eyes found mine briefly, is not my biological mother. And Richard Wilson was not my biological father. She touched one of the ivory roses gently, as if drawing strength from it. In his letter to me, the one he wrote, knowing he would never see me grow up, Richard explained why he left. He told me about the DNA test, about his suspicions regarding my birth. He told me how he watched me from afar, attending my school events and driving past our house on holidays. Her voice wavered slightly. He told me that walking away from me was the hardest thing he'd ever done, and that he regretted it every day of his life. The sunlight through the stained glass shifted, painting Rebecca's face in blues and golds as she continued. Most people would say he abandoned me, and they'd be right. But his letter helped me understand something I've been struggling with my entire life. She paused, taking a deep breath. I've always felt like I was missing something, like there was a hollow space inside me that I could never quite fill, no matter how much success I achieved or how perfect I tried to make my life appear. I felt tears welling in my eyes, remembering all the times I'd noticed that restlessness in her, the constant striving, the dissatisfaction that seemed to follow her even in moments of triumph. I tried to fill that emptiness with achievements, with possessions, with a perfect wedding to a perfect man from a perfect family. A sad smile crossed her face. And when none of that worked, I lashed out at the one person who had never stopped loving me, never stopped supporting me. Her eyes found mine again. My mother, not by blood but by choice, by love, by the 1,000 daily sacrifices she made that I never appreciated. The tears I'd been holding back spilled onto my cheeks. Rebecca's gaze held mine for a moment longer before returning to the gathering. Richard's letter ended with these words. The truth is, Rebecca, family isn't just DNA. It's who stays. It's who loves you even when you're unlovable. It's who sacrifices for you without expecting anything in return. He wrote that he had failed that test, but that Margaret, my mother, had passed it every single day. She picked up the small bouquet, holding it close to her heart. So I'm here today, not just to say goodbye to Richard Wilson, but to thank him for giving me the truce, even though it came too late for us, and for helping me see what was right in front of me all along, a mother whose love was never conditional, never dependent on biology or perfection or status. Rebecca stepped away from the podium and approached the casket. Gently, she placed the bouquet atop it, her hand lingering for a moment on the polished wood. "Rest in peace, Dad," she whispered, just loud enough for those nearest to hear. "I forgive you." After the service, as the small crowd dispersed into the autumn afternoon, Rebecca walked toward me. Without a word, she sat beside me in the now empty row, our shoulders touching lightly. "I'd like to come home," she said softly. "If that's okay." I nodded, unable to speak around the lump in my throat. That was 2 months ago. I now spend my days sitting in the same chair on the porch, watching the wind play with the leaves. Rebecca comes to visit every Sunday. Sometimes she just holds my hand in silence. We've talked about finding Emma, my biological daughter, her biological parents. We even went as far as hiring a private investigator. But in the end, we decided that some doors are better left unopened. Some truths can wait until we're ready. Rebecca is working at a community legal clinic now, helping families navigate the complexities of adoption and foster care. She's rented a small apartment near the clinic, but she comes home often. Last week, she brought me a potted orchid, delicate, beautiful, and requiring careful attention to thrive. Like relationships, she'd said with a knowing smile. And every time the phone rings and I see her name, I answer with a smile. Because on that day, when she needed me most, I was too busy to answer. But now I know that some calls deserve to be answered. Yesterday, as we sat on the porch watching the sunset, Rebecca asked me a question that had clearly been weighing on her mind. "Do you ever regret it?" she said. "Raising a child who wasn't yours by blood?" I looked at her, this beautiful, complicated woman who had brought me equal measures of joy and heartache over the years, and the answer came easily. "Not for a single moment," I said. "Biology didn't make you my daughter. Love did." She leaned her head against my shoulder then, just as she had as a little girl. And as the last light of day painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, I realized that sometimes the most precious truths are the ones we discover in our darkest moments. Family isn't just shared DNA, it's shared history, shared struggle, shared forgiveness, and sometimes, when you're lucky, it's finding your way back to each other after being lost. Sometimes the most profound truths are revealed in our darkest moments. When Rebecca told me to get out of her life, I never imagined it would lead us both to discover what family truly means. And the pain of that moment, and my decision to cancel her wedding, opened a door to a truth we might never have faced otherwise. What would you have done in my place? Would you have continued supporting someone who had rejected you so cruelly, or would you have found the courage to step away? I've learned that motherhood isn't defined by DNA or biology. It's defined by the thousands of small sacrifices made day after day, by the love that persists even when it's not returned, by the forgiveness that follows hurt. When I discovered Rebecca might not be my biological daughter, it didn't diminish my love for her. It revealed its true depth. If you found out someone you loved wasn't who you thought they were, would it change how you feel about them? If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who might need to hear it. Follow our channel for more real-life stories that explore the complicated bonds of family, love, and forgiveness. Remember, in life's most painful moments, we often discover our greatest strength, and sometimes the call we're too busy to answer today might be the one that changes everything tomorrow.